thank you everybody for being here and sticking it out. I promise your time won't have been ill spent because we've got a wonderful panel this afternoon. I'm very grateful to have been invited to moderate the session, not least because I get a lot of kudos without having to do much, but also because I have the privilege of sitting next to and hearing from three people that I respect a great deal in the art world in which we work, and who together probably wouldn't like me saying that they have a combined knowledge bank of many decades, even though they all look so young. So the panel this afternoon is comprised of Lynn Roberts, who is a specialist art historian working who for at least 30 years has been primarily focusing on picture frames and the significance, value, meaning of frames in historic and contemporary settings. Peter Schade, head of the National Gallery's framing department, who has been at the National Gallery since 2005 and who just reminded me that in the last 18 years has reframed only 380 of the collection's top masterpieces. And Paul Mitchell, who is really the world's leading specialist dealer in historic picture frames and who either single-handedly or in collaboration with the other members of the panel has been able to reframe countless masterpieces that are real poster boys and fridge magnets for all of us, and which have benefited greatly from his interventions over the last several decades. So I thought I would start us off really by saying that I think the way we're going to frame this discussion, forgive the terrible puns, they will get worse, thinking about historic frames in their wider context, the making of new frames to fit into or reflect what we know of historic practices, patterns, and settings, and something that I'm particularly interested in is frames as A, works of art, B, tools or agents of conservation for the paintings that they protect and were made to protect, but C, objects that themselves need conservation, care, and research. And so I thought before we get onto this, I should remember to say that there will be a little bit of time for questions at the end of the session. So I'd be grateful if everybody could store up what will no doubt be many questions for the last 15 minutes, and there'll be a roving mic that my colleague Francesca will bring round to you if you put up your hands. Can I just kick off the discussion here by asking, as we look at what's on the screen behind us here, which are large painted apparatuses, to ask perhaps some of the simplest questions. What is a frame? And what does it do?
Well, if you're talking about these very early frames on box altars, which is what these are, and I think they began in about the 12th century, they start off as a protective edging to the altar, and you can see why a protective edging is needed in some cases. There are collections of them in Scandinavia and Spain, but unfortunately we don't have any of them left here. But the ones that you can see often have a lot of abrasions at the bottom, where the feet of the priests have kicked against the bottom of the altar over the years. So there was a raised edging put there to protect it. And of course, once you've got a raised edging there and you start painting the altar, you see that the frame around the edge can be decorated, or it can be used for religious symbols which have to do with the picture painted on the flat surface. And then as the liturgy changes, the box altar develops into a frontal, which is the bit that stands across the bottom of the altar, and then a dossal is made, which is the altarpiece that stands on the top, on the back of the altar. And you can see on the left at the bottom the Thornum Parva altarpiece, which is still in place in a little tiny church in Suffolk in the middle of a field. And its amazing survival, which was protected from all the burning of altarpieces during the Reformation, because it was stored in a stable, and it was only found, I think, in the 19th century, and it's still there now in the church. It used to be in Thetford Priory, and the frontal that belongs to it is in the Musée de Cluny in Paris. And both of these have quite slender frames, but the framing apparatus itself, as it were, extends down into the painting and has this sort of architectural form. And this goes on into religious altarpieces as they expand and get bigger and become whole sort of facades of churches, which I think you can see on the next slide.
Yeah, this is a beautifully compelling parallel here to put these side by side, and it's something that we don't often think about, the organisation of the space of an altarpiece in relation to the architecture of the church.
And I think it's because the artist is trying to produce a picture of the celestial church inside the temporal church, so to speak.
But there's a big difference between the previous slide, where the frames really were just flat ornaments and relate probably to illuminated manuscripts, so really just an ornamented border around the edge, whereas the other slide gives you a sense of space, and there's a receding floor, and the architecture suggests actual architecture and therefore an actual space and a door that you look through.
Lynn and Paul, something that I love in the history of European picture frames, which you published in '96, is that right?
Same time as Frameworks.
The same time as Frameworks.
And the exhibition here.
You say that that frames, that their function is in varying degrees utilitarian, decorative, and symbolic. That's a beautifully concise précis, but would you expand a little on that?
To be for the dictionary, yes. Yes, I remember, I think, the actual introduction to describe the functions, all of the functions that a frame has, went on for a whole page, but they were with semicolons all the way, because it's doing so many things at once. Talk about multitasking. The more you look at it, the frame has, first of all, to protect the picture. It's got to enable it to be suspended on a wall surface. It has to be an opportunity for decoration of all sorts. It's, after all, designed to draw your eye towards the image. And there's all sorts of tricks have been done to do that over the centuries, just like they do today in films. I'm reminded of particularly Spanish frames, where you can have a frame that's four sides are virtually just black, but huge great leaves at each corner, gilded, so that the moment you come into the church, you don't see the picture properly, but the light reflecting off these corners is announcing that you've got a picture to look at when you walk down here and get closer. And it's this sort of business like a car's headlights, practically. The power of using daylight coming through the windows onto these frames. We have a very sort of insulated view of what gold leaf was all about, because we look at it under fluorescent light, for example, and it's flat, dull. And watching the process of gilding going on is, of course, it's always magical when you think it's a sheet of gold is 1/4 millionth of an inch thick, and the next news is it's blinding you with light as it's burnished. That's one of the forms of decoration. It's combined with other carving, stucco work. the frame has, it's often the object which is the first thing to be decided on, not the picture. Art historians have generally got it the other way around, but you've got to have a patron first. He's got a building of some sort, either he's the church if he's a clerical thing, or a secular home, but the surroundings that it's going into are going to be affecting the design of the frame. So you've got all those features which we're going to come through quite a few further down the line. It's a question of working out that the frame has been determined to go in a certain position and designed very often by an architect that may be involved with the building in the first place. And the painting is a thing that could have been handled by a great many people in the A to Z dictionary at the time. But not that many people would have been making frames like they did. And it's simply a very impressive thing to see a picture that's in its undisturbed setting. You get the drift of what it was all about in the first place. Why did it happen? And it's what we're always striving for, or would like to encourage museums to do, is to try to demonstrate to the viewer, if they know this frame is contemporary or original to the picture, let's see the evidence and what sort of setting might it have been in. Something inspired, like putting some furniture near it, or wall brackets, or the use of silver candlesticks.
I think we're going to come on to that.
Yeah.
Just watch if you're
Sorry,
scraping
yeah.
against your microphone. Peter, this is, I think it touches here really brilliantly on your role in the National Gallery, because you have to recreate or recontextualize or revive paintings that have been placed in frames that are either too big, too small, erroneous, the wrong period, the wrong focus, drawing attention away. How do you deal with something which Jim Bennett, in a poem called Frame Builder, puts really beautifully, a piece of art to be ignored? How do you create something that you then you hope people don't really notice?
Yeah, but ideally by finding frames of the period or finding very good samples of the period. And actually this slide shows quite nicely the gap that there is in original frames. We have some original frames illustrated here on the left, where the frames are actual part of the structure of the pieces themselves. They're made from the same piece of wood or nailed to the panel. And then we have a huge gap from about 1510 to the Rigaud portrait, more or less, and we've got two Paracel hunting scenes that are slightly earlier. But to about 1700, we've got no original frames from about 1510 to 1700, and that's the bulk of the National Gallery's collection. And what we try to do is, by careful acquisitions of frames of the same period, and by supplementing where we can't find old frames with copies of frames, as faithful as possible as we can achieve, we try to give the paintings back the period setting which suits them best, and which often is the most invisible. Quite often, if you frame a painting in the wrong frame, quite often you see the frame much more than if it's the right appropriate frame that looks of the right age. Yeah. Then the frame also steps back and lets the image, puts the image at center stage, which is
Yes, you hardly
sort of what we
notice
try
it.
to do. Ideally, yes.
When you hardly notice it, it means it's doing its job.
Yeah.
What are some of the signs? I mean, you talked, Peter, about things that are actually nailed in place or maybe carved out of the same piece of timber, as we know painters in the Trecento, Quattrocento used quite regularly. What other signs does one look out for in terms of an original frame? How would we notice it?
beyond that, well, when you look for one outside, I think it's basically like the National Gallery. You can just assume that there aren't any in between those two, and then you have to kind of just think of whether it's, why it's in the frame that it is, and whether it's a clever choice in terms of finding a frame of the right period, or whether it's a clever reproduction, or whether it's a bad choice. And when I first came to National Gallery, I thought about 80% of the paintings could be improved with better frames. And because, partly because the National Gallery's collection has come through so many other collecting hands before it entered the National Gallery, and almost every time something gets collected or ownership changes, the one thing you can change is the frame, and inevitably almost every single change of ownership means a change to frame. Also for reasons of transport, for all kinds of practical reasons, frames get discarded and put aside, and a new frame is made or found.
So actually a changing frame doesn't need to be inauthentic. It's not necessarily inauthentic.
But if you look for authentic frames,
evidence.
the best place to go to is a provincial museum in Italy, or an obscure church, or somewhere provincial in France where there haven't been many changes to whereas the great masterpieces that we have gone through so many hands that they're very unlikely to survive in original frames.
And so we might see evidence of their ownership history, or the collecting tastes and the movement of a painting from a frame rather than from the painting itself, perhaps. Sometimes.
Yes, and sometimes we can see we've got a little the Alzheimer Baptism of Christ has got a frame that was carved when it was part of a French collection in the early 18th century. We don't know where it was, but we know that it must have been part of an important French collection because of the frame.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, I wanted to pick up briefly here on a group of 3 articles that you've recently published on the Frame blog about artists' letters and artists and writers on frames over different periods from the 14th century to the present day. That presumably is a repository of information about how artists and their patrons and viewers looked at and understood frames. Do we get good information from those sources?
Well, you do. It's quite rare, of course. It's just that occasionally things crop up in letters and journals and art critics writing. Of course, there are lots of them in the 19th century, which is the most recent article, where the Impressionists are busy writing in journals, and critics are mentioning the frames more often. So you get quite a lot of information there, especially because the Impressionist frames were such a vast change from the traditional salon frame, the sort of gilded, heavily carved and ornamented frame, or ornamented in plaster. And the salon insisted on gold carved frames for a long period, quite late into the 19th century. And because the Impressionists were revolting against the salon as an institution and its rules for the sort of paintings which would be displayed, they were also revolting against these rules for framing things in golden frames. And it also coincided with the science of the time, because in 1839, Chevreul, this scientist who was working at a tapestry factory, published a book on the laws of the contrasts of colour. And the Impressionists read this book, and it greatly influenced the frames they were using. And they used white painted frames to start with. And we know in the third Impressionist exhibition in 1877, quite a lot of Pissarro's paintings were in white frames, and probably some of the others, almost certainly Degas. And it makes such a difference. You can look at the article on the Frame blog if you want to. It shows you lots of the pictures, and I have montaged one of the Pissarros, which was in that exhibition, into a white frame, and similarly Degas' Absinthe Drinker, which looks completely different in a white frame, and it sort of looks more, it sounds stupid to say it looks more modern, but you get a much better idea of what these artists were working for at the time as a whole work of art, and they hoped it would be one and indivisible. They came back to gold frames later because they saw there were advantages to them with some subjects, you know, the colour fitted better with the gilded frame, but also they were driven to it partly because the dealers were reframing their pictures in order to be able to sell them, and the clients wanted gold frames.
We've come, I think, into the 20th century already. And,
yes, I'm sorry,
no,
That's
quite all right. But I think thinking about the historical context in which frames have been viewed, we start to move away, or perhaps multiple strands start to develop of frames as organizing structures within spaces like Orvieto Cathedral, which actually were built over many decades or even centuries, and so were incrustations of very varied images. And so frames worked as organizing principles, to the development of frames for portable objects or within domestic interiors, particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries. And this is a lovely example that you cite from Schleswig-Holstein of the interior of a private house, a secular setting, with ornamentation that is carried through a range of different mediums. Within that context, do we know how frame makers were considered? What part of society were they in? How were they perceived by other people?
Well, I think they generally made a lot of other things as well. I mean, with the earlier frames, with church frames, there were very specialist carvers and carpenters who were putting together great big constructions and carving them beautifully, and then the gilder would come along and gild them, and then the painter would come along at the last minute and fill in the blank spaces. But as time moves on, I think the people who were producing frames were producing furniture and anything else that could be carved, and so everything within the interior sort of fitted in together, and they reflected each other and echoed each other, and also the silver work within that interior, the patterns on the carpets, the paintings on the ceilings, everything was of a piece. I mean, this isn't the earliest, the Palladian interior by William Kent isn't the earliest example of that, because you get Cardinal Leonardo de' Medici in the 17th century, reframing all his Renaissance pictures and whatever it was in these enormously elaborate Mannerist frames, so that the whole hang in his gallery was of a piece. And I don't know if there's any furniture which reflects this, but I think it's an early example of a gallery that has all the frames matching.
You have this wonderful phrase in the history of European picture frames, where in Palladian interiors, paintings were hardly more than elements in an abstract arrangement of objects, anchored to their setting by the correspondence of their frames within the ornamentations of surrounding objects. It's a beautiful way of tying a space together.
Yes, and there it is. He's drawn it. He's drawn the elevation of this wall for Houghton Hall, and it's got all the pictures fitted in like a jigsaw puzzle, and they all join up together because of the frames around them. And I think the one over the chimney piece, is that a Rubens?
Rubens, yeah.
Rubens family group, and it's probably gone off to the Hermitage now. But it didn't matter that it was by Rubens and that it's a completely different period, because everything sort of fits in together with the door frames and the chimney piece itself and the cornice around the top of the room.
Peter, how do museums that you've worked with, and Paul as well, I mean, all three of you, I'm sorry, how do museums that you've worked with try to recreate such contexts or suggest something of a rich palatial interior like this in a modern museum setting?
Very rarely, but Manchester
was great after Timothy Clifford
I mean,
got
that
at it.
museum
And he
was transformed.
repainted it and, yes, put in furniture and palms in pots. It was this whole Victorian gallery come to life again.
Yeah.
But that hardly ever happens in England, I'm afraid.
It touches on the whole point that we've managed to disconnect the arts from each other, when in fact they were all happening simultaneously. The architect's designing the building, he's designing where the pictures are going to go, what the frames are going to look like. You can get the pictures later, you get the artist to paint them, or they're going to be doing a fresco or paint the wall in some way. It's that we have compartmentalized it, whereas that these pictures seem to be of the prime importance, whereas they were more interested in having a very pleasing vista of their room, as here in Houghton. And of course, if you tinkered around with it and started to put all these pictures up in different frames, it would just look ridiculous. It's an example where the leading element in this business is the architect, and it always has been. And he's closely followed by the wood sculptors, the really brilliant wood sculptors, whose basic skill levels were such that it made some of the artists look as if they'd hardly got started. And what they are doing is creating an illusion of 3 dimensions, which they are producing 3 dimensions, which in the 2-dimensional picture is enhancing its trick, that it isn't flat, it's got depth, depending on what's going on around it.
You've said something really wonderful recently to me, that artists calculate the effect of a frame on depth in a painting, that they are inherently interlinked.
Absolutely, they certainly are. And you often see images of artists putting the finishing touches or working on a picture on the easel, which already has the frame on it. Particularly landscapes and seascapes, where the deep cove of the frame is acting as a reflector, which I was referring to earlier on. You can test it. We've put one on the easel, put out the lights, just have low lighting, put the picture on the easel without the frame, you get a light meter and it registers X. Put the frame around it and it just shoots up because it's picking the light up all the way around, and it's literally crossing back and forth over the picture. It's the purpose of the gilding, of going back to what I said earlier, is to attract your attention to the work of art and enhance its depth. Well, it works.
I mean, spaces like this, your this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, the frame fits the setting, sometimes almost more than it fits the picture, or it's intended to fit both, but it's to do with the wider setting. I wanted to ask Peter, in the National Gallery, for instance, how is that dealt with? Do you
These kind of settings are the kind of nemesis of they're kind of the reason why there's such disorder amongst the old master paintings, because very few actually have kept significant frames from French 18th century collections or from fine other interiors. Usually the interiors are so fine that they lose their frames when they are taken out, but then they're put into bad versions of those kind of frames, because people somehow think that in French also used to seeing Dutch 17th century paintings and French 18th century frames, because that's how many of the paintings came to this country, that they are then put into bad versions of that, and often very, very awful versions of that, cheaply mass-produced or very badly adjusted in size and regilded versions of those frames. But the reason for these trends is these fabulous interiors, which are as far removed from the artist's intention as you possibly can go often, because the artist, an Italian Renaissance artist would not have understood these interiors at all as a possibility for a setting for their paintings.
Jumping around in time a little, because sticking with the National Gallery a bit, but I wanted to ask you, Lynn, you've been looking and thinking about the Arnoldini portrait and how it's been reframed over time and what we can glean from the historical documents surrounding what we know about its frame, its shutters or wings, and how they've been removed.
Well, I think that's more up Peter Street, because he's been studying Van Eyck's paintings and frames in great detail. This just came up because the Arnoldini portrait has had so many frames while it's been in the National Gallery. I think it came in probably in about, was it 1828 or something?
1660, I think it was first refused by the National Gallery and then acquired.
Isn't that
generation
amazing?
later.
They turned it down. It had been looted by Napoleon's brother in Spain. Napoleon is responsible for so much, so many frames getting lost. And what was his name, the chap in Spain? Was it Jerome? I can't remember. But anyway, when the British arrived, he gathered all his stuff together in this immense baggage train and tried to cross the
Pyrenees.
The Pyrenees. He tried to cross the Pyrenees and get back into France, and the British pounced on him, and he ran away, and I think they captured him. And they found, a soldier found the Arnoldini portrait in amongst all the loot, and he took it home and kept it for some time, which is rather nice. Sort of kept it in his bedroom in his sort of crummy little flat in London. And some soldiers found Napoleon's brother's silver chamber pot, and I believe they still use it in their regiment for punch on celebratory evenings, which is
well washed,
a nice
I hope.
end to the story. But anyway, so when it came into the National Gallery, I don't know if it was already in that black frame with the gold inlay, or whether that was put on it in the gallery. I can't remember. And then that wooden one was made for it, which I think they thought was a sort of analogue of a... Yes, the one in the middle, an analogue of a kind of Van Eyck frame. And then there was a gold one, which I forgot to put in. And then this one at the end is quite interesting, because Holman Hunt mentions it in his book, or his biography, which was written about him. When he was a boy, he wandered down into the National Gallery and he saw the Arnoldini marriage in this frame, and he thought what a great frame it was, which obviously Peter wouldn't agree with at all. And that's the one which is now back on it, and it does treat it a bit like a sort of altarpiece, which obviously it isn't. But I think everybody is so used to this, it's become very familiar.
This is perhaps a problem, isn't it? The familiarity of a painting in a certain frame can lead to lethargy or a resistance to change things, to mix things up. I mean, how have you dealt with that, Paul, in dealing with the museums that you work with?
You see it all the time if you actually look at the frames, and you can see them and examine their effect on the picture, positive or negative. But I would say over half the frames I look at, the picture's running on 3 cylinders as a result of its frame. That it's just malfunctioning, holding it back. It's as if you've got the handbrake on, you know. Change it, and it's magical, because you don't have to... They don't have to say where it's come from, who's done the framing. That isn't the point. It's what's the impact. When you watch the local friends of a given provincial museum in America look at the Rubens on a Sunday morning with the curator, and he says, what have you done to the picture? Have you cleaned it or something? it just looks fabulous. And they said, no, we've reframed it. And there's a sort of silence until they realize, well, why did you take so long about it? Because they've been used to looking at this highly uncomfortable frame on a picture, not knowing how much it was detracting from the picture. And this is repeated all the time, to the point where the curator said, right, he's doing tours on the frames himself, which a lot of museums ought to be trying to do, or, you know, there's absolutely no excuse these days for a curator in any museum not to be conversant with his frames. When they get the bug, it's fantastic to see it happen, because they could, for the price of buying one new old master, they can reframe an entire gallery in contemporary period frames, and it's absolute magic. All the locals get it. He puts up a notice inviting people to put their names down for a Sunday tour. Usually half an A4 would do it. Well, this went into 3 A4 sheets. He had a huge audience turn up. All they wanted to hear about was the frames. So, you know, we've seen it in London Art Week. Groups come in, we have no idea who they are, we show them go through our stuff, and they're absolutely knocked for six and write you a very nice letter to tell you so, you know. So, you know, if we start to give people a handle on how to look at frames, and first of all then, is this frame genuine? Is it fake? Is it reproduction? Is it got anything to do with the period of the painting? What is it, in other words? But there's all sorts of tick boxes to go through to establish where you are with this object. But the impetus it gives to the institution, well, look at the National. It used to be a real struggle to get a picture framed before but once it gets going, I remember being fortunate enough to be invited by the National Gallery in Washington to examine all of the frames in the collection and grade them by original, fabulous, you know, 5-star, 4, 3, 2, 1, etc. So that they started work on the poor examples further down the line. And I said, you're going to have to get some money to do this, because it isn't like before. If you try and frame something, they have to scrape it out of the conservation budget. There was never a budget for frames in American museums for a very long time. It came up in one of the annual meetings of the Museums Association, and they inserted this extra thing on their database. You know, it needs some money, but they got it, reframed a lot of things, are still doing it. Their different directors and other curators have moved to other museums around America, like they do every 4 years. They said, right, let's get started. You know, we've seen what can be done. Houston was a particularly good example. Pete Bowron left the National Gallery. He didn't want to be the director at Houston. He wanted to be the chief curator, which he was. And he immediately launched a reframing campaign. Well, it might not sound such a big deal, but boy, when you see the changes, and they like to demonstrate it and show, because people don't realize what they've actually been looking at for so long is it's so undercooked, you know, it just doesn't come across properly. I mean, the artists must be thrilled if they could come and take a look. But it was that remark, was why did it take you so long to do it? And when are you going to do the Rembrandt? You know, because that's even bigger headache. You know. Anyway,
I mean, thinking about that with the Arnoldini portrait, it's obviously one of the most important paintings in the National Gallery's collection. It's perhaps, not even perhaps, it is certainly the most published, researched, worked on Northern European, Northern Renaissance painting in the world. What's the solution? Is there an appetite for trying to reframe it? Because, Lynn, you came up with this as a way of thinking about what the documents tell us.
Because it was described like that in about 1700, and that isn't its original frame, but that's what it had been adapted to, possibly this is a montage I did, obviously, and the panels in the shutters wouldn't have been on the inside like that with porphyry. They would have been on the outside, but I wanted you to see what it might have looked like on the outside. So you have to imagine those are the shutters, so to speak.
An example is the Arnoldini marriage, where the frame that it had 80 years after it was painted, or 70 years after it was painted, was already not the original frame, because it had an Ovid inscription that turned the image into a genre painting rather than a portrait that it was. So even it's most likely that even at that point, this sort of triptychon arrangement was already something that was no longer original. What we know from Jan van Eyck's surviving frames, and thankfully a lot of them have survived, or a larger proportion than for most artists, is that they tend to be very, very clever and very ingenious, usually very flat, but with a very clever device, or very clever, with lots of little very flat steps that give an illusion of space, and that lead you into the painting. And the one thing that the current frame, which I think is completely awful, it's like it's modeled on the design of the Gothic chalet, but it does give depth to the painting, and that's really difficult to make or find a frame that is flat and fine enough and gives that perception of depth, which is the one thing that this frame actually, why this frame to some extent works for the picture, but and also as something you cannot block out. You cannot see the painting without seeing the frame, because it's just so crazy.
But also, it's an interesting example of a frame that itself has 150 years of history to it. It's a modern frame, but it's also an important part of the life of the painting, isn't it?
In the store, because I think it was taken off quite early on. I think it was framed in different frames since about the 1920s, but it was kept in store, which is not at that time is not a given.
Paul, you mentioned that there's a swell of interest in some of the American museums. I wanted to say that this is an institution that shall remain nameless, but I see that I've put the institution's name on here. This is a good painting by an anonymous artist of Catherine of Aragon in its original frame. But it's interesting to note that on the website, on the online database collection that can be searched, the frame has been cut off the image. But that's not an isolated example at all, is it?
It is practically never put around the image. It's taken us 20 years, anybody in the frame world, to persuade the sale rooms to publish the frame on a picture. And I can remember getting Sotheby's in the 70s and 80s and 90s from time to time, amazing frame on a picture. And they'd take 2 pages. Gosh, that's expensive, you know. The second one had a picture of the image of the painting with the frame on. Well, the guy that's going to buy this thing, he wouldn't have had the faintest idea about this frame if he hadn't come and seen it. It's making a big difference. And, but the fact, the excision of the frame, I can remember thinking how many instances we've been to major international monographic exhibitions and thought that this is a unique moment to record all these Titians from all around the world, their frames, because it's a lot of traveling to see them one at a time in their hometown sort of thing. And that's something that if ever there was enough time, one should be following up these grand exhibitions with an article about the frames. But by the time you've got back, you're so busy with so many other things. You've still got all the information, but it's a little task that might happen. I remember insisting on doing this in one thing was the Joseph Wright of Derby exhibition at the Tate years back. explaining that this artist, as a rare event in British artists, but in the 18th century, had his own idea about frames, and he had a few patterns that were solely for his works. So you could actually spot a Wright of Derby by the frame before you even get up the ladder and take a look at the picture. And Judy Edgerton allowed that to happen. She had quite a bit of persuading to do to the then director, but this was the first big blockbuster catalogue that had a chapter on the frames. And I'm glad to say we were trying to compete with the conservators because they had a chapter too, so it rather fits with the subject today. But,
so what can we do alongside that? What should we be petitioning our museums to put information on labels?
On their website. I mean, the Met does a lot. It's got
a very rich collection of frames,
yes,
thanks to the Lehman bequest.
And it publishes 2 or more images, so you can see the picture without the frame and the picture in the frame. And I mean, what you say about the NPG is very true, because they've got all the pictures which were taken for Jacob's book. And you go and look at the picture online, and you can see quite a big image of the painting. And then when it was if it was in Jacob's book, and there's a picture of it in the frame, there's a little tiny picture like that. So it's showing you the picture in its frame, but you can't actually see it. And looking at Catherine of Aragon, you can see how that frame it gives depth and recession to her portrait. I mean, even if it's not a particularly brilliant portrait, it's a good Tudor portrait, and this gives it sort of life and substance. It makes it a 3-dimensional object. I mean, why not put that on the website? It's mad not to. This is how you look at it hanging on the wall. This is how you should be looking at it online. This is how it should be with all paintings. Paintings aren't just a 2-dimensional flat image on a white page. They're 3-dimensional objects with depth. And that's how you should be looking at them on the internet.
Yeah, here. I think everyone's getting a bit riled up. I like it. Lynn, here I thought that's a nice segue into this onto this slide, which is all about depth. It's all about 3-dimensionality and the creation of an object that is much larger, broader, and more multifaceted than the devotional image itself. But it also comes into play that we've got materials like stucco and other forms of mediums which are not the richest. How do we think about these objects and their frames in this kind of context?
I think we think of Renaissance collections as being made by princes and cardinals and popes, but obviously as the middle class got bigger and more prosperous, they wanted to have paintings as well in their houses, and they were all, good Catholics, and they wanted devotional images in their homes, just as princes might have private chapels with altarpieces. And so with these reliefs, from Donatello onwards, marble reliefs of the Madonna were produced, and they're very beautiful and incredibly popular, and they were built into the walls of palaces, and they were built into the walls of churches, and they had their own architectural frames. But they were also reproduced in the workshops of the sculptors in stucco, and you can see this one here. The marble is now in the Hermitage, and I don't think it's got a frame on it at all, which is a bit mad, but there you are. I don't think people know how to frame these things, but it's all the same relief made in Rossellino's workshop, and the one on the bottom left has got a removable carved wooden altarpiece, so that would have been a bit more expensive, and it's painted with the dove of the Holy Spirit in the pediment at the top, and it's got a carved apron at the bottom, so it looks quite grand and altarpiecey, but it would have been in a sort of rich merchant's home, and the stucco itself was painted to make it look more sort of realistic, like a cross between the sculpture and the painting. And then all these other stuccos were produced, which sort of went down in a descending order of not very goodness till you got to the bottom, and they were quite cheap reproductions, and they had their own integral frames. And then the very not very good one, right on the right-hand side, was obviously in some family house. And then at some point in the 17th century, they decided to upgrade it, and they put this incredible Mannerist carved wooden frame around the outside of it. So it's doubly framed, and it looks grander, and presumably the family had gone up a bit in the world, and they decided to make it more special.
It's images or objects in their frames like this that helped to inform this decision to reframe one of the National Gallery's paintings by Ghirlandaio. This was a great collaboration between all the members of this panel. So can I ask how the opportunity came about? What was the process behind it?
Certain people have records of frames that frame dealers have. And they put two and two together.
Actually, it was your son, it was Mark's idea to enable me to see the stock that Paul Mitchell holds, and a painting for which I would have never gone to find a frame for, because it's so unlikely that somebody has a frame for an archtop Madonna and Child of the late 15th century. It's not something for which, I mean, if I thought of a new frame for that, I would probably think of a reproduction frame to make. I would never expect anyone to have an original frame for that. But by looking through the collection, often fabulous collection of frames, I came across this one and realized that it was an almost exact fit for the Madonna and Child. And not only an exact fit in size, but also in intention, because our painting has got this black inner recess painted around the edge, which in the flat frame, in the second to last frame, looks like a sort of passe-partout edge, but is a receding edge that aligns magically with the frame that we found, and suddenly it looks like continuation of the frame into the painting, and the Madonna and Child move into a space between the landscape and us, really, that separates them out, and it becomes like a very three-dimensional object suddenly. But that was, you have to tell us where the frame was, how did you come across it?
The distinguished, celebrated framer Paul Levy, does that name ring a bell? When he retired, he had a series of sales of his stock in Christie's, went on for a long time, and we made every effort to buy whichever we could, but I can remember particularly seeing that this one is such a great collector's piece. I mean, if you're in this business, you have to simply buy the best of everything, and it will find its destination in good time. It's the same for the art dealer. If he buys fine pictures, they will sell, or they will locate a patron. In this case, Peter did the location, but this is such a rare object to see in the first place, away from its picture. And generally, this sort of frame would have stayed on, but it wouldn't have just been something available. But Levy was fantastic at picking up things in Italy and elsewhere, a great craftsman and a sort of leader in his generation. He really, the trouble is, his problem throughout his career, he says, is that the client just doesn't get it. And we know what he means. There's one particular distinguished picture dealer sitting in the audience who's always been absolutely mad about framing and getting it right and doing it absolutely perfectly, which is, has been a great joy to work with over many years and see the consequences of it too.
I'm just going to switch to this one, if I may, because this is another reframing triumph at your hands, Paul, and a painting that I think the UK feels rather got away. How did this opportunity come around? How did you put two and two together here?
Well, it wasn't so much the UK thought it had got away, it was New York, because the fact it went over to the West Coast was a sort of major eruption for the art scene in America. I mean, it's such a stunning picture by a Tuscan artist, and it had got itself into a Venetian frame, which the sitter then perceived to be Cosimo, can't remember which one now, but they thought this guy was a much more highly placed individual, but they wouldn't have been seen dead in Florence with this gold frame on. But the chief curator at the Getty came to see us, and he gave me, we knew they just bought this picture, and he'd lived for 6 months in Florence. He knew exactly the kind of frame it would have had, which is such a good start. And this is it. One can prove its validity, its design, and when you analyze it, there's so many aspects of this which fit perfectly for the Mannerist date. And they put two together. He couldn't believe when he came in, there was this thing hanging at the end of the corridor, and he said, this is it, It practically fitted. The alteration was minor, but this whole Mannerist treatment of traditional ornament has been overblown. The gadrooning, as it's called, that's running around here, with parcel gilding all the way through it, called lumina legno. It's a fantastically clever device. It couldn't be more modern looking, and it absolutely pulls you straight to the sitter. I mean, you walk in a gallery and you see this, and it's hypnotically powerful, which of course is all being done by the geometry and the design and the sophistication of the parcel gilding, because all these little passages of gold are doing their job of reflecting at you and also highlighting the sitter. But no matter who this guy was or is, you couldn't miss him. The other frame, was just rather bland. But because this guy knew exactly what it should be in, there was only one of these we have ever seen at anywhere in the world. And it was with the Pfefferle family in Munich, frame dealers, and they wouldn't sell it. I'd seen it long ago, and I have a German friend of mine that was working for me, and I said, you see what you can do. He went out there and came back with the frame. They didn't want the conquest to be from a Brit, I think. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it worked. And that was only about a year before the Getty bought this. Very satisfying for them too, but it's... anyway, it was... I've seen two others, and they are reproductions of it, which must have been made after the model that Pfefferle had, but we're still waiting to see another one just like this.
It's a very good comparison, because the frame on the left is a period frame of high quality, 16th century Italian frame. For most museums, that would be a very good choice and basically job done. But the difference of having a suitable period frame to a kind of neutral period frame is huge, and well done for the Getty to spend the time and effort and money.
It also shows us one factor when we were going right back to the beginning of the impact that frames make. The finish, the surface of a frame, its colouring is vital. And when you just see this, the chiaroscuro in this picture, the lights, the darks, the whole palette, it's just in a different world when you have a darker frame on it.
It's a wonderful combination of restraint and ostentation all at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And but you don't need to be a specialist of any kind to observe that parallel sitting. Everybody can tell you that. We've had complete strangers coming in, looking at these sort of before and afters, and they get actually excited. And they didn't think it was going to be that interesting.
It is exciting, and there's something, a turn of phrase that you use, Lynn, in the history of European picture frames, where you say that it's surprising, I mean shocking even, that frames so often go unrecognized, unnoticed and undervalued, given that a picture gallery displays as many frames as it does paintings. It's just a simple fact, a simple piece of truth, but it's a wonderfully eloquent way of saying, guys, wake up, we've got to look at these things properly.
But I think the cat's, so to speak, out of the bag now, and I think it's probably beginning to turn round to the stage where if you're a museum and you're neglecting your frames or you don't have a clue about them, you might just find somebody else who's going to take your place, because literally the change it makes, as you've seen here, and it doesn't have to be an antique frame, but if it was an exact copy of this, which we can do, Peter could do, it's going to do the same job, and it's done with authentic academic knowledge. You can prove it. You know that I've seen that exhibited, the Pontormo now, with a Cassoni in walnut underneath it, exactly the same period. All the lid of the Cassoni is quadrooned like the frame. It fits in perfectly. The chairs have the similar sort of ornaments on them. This is a sort of brilliant piece of matching, furnishing, and then this optical device of making it quite sure you couldn't possibly miss this sitter when you walk in. Although, of course, he's slightly underwhelming when he turns out to be somebody they didn't expect. Yes.
I'd like to round out this discussion now because I'm aware of the time and I do want people to be able to ask questions. If I may start with one, how do we care for historic frames, given that we are more and more, I hope, seeing important, historic, valuable picture frames being brought into museum settings and other settings too? How do we look after them as objects?
I think what Lynn does, the propagation of knowledge about frames and doing it in a way that is accessible and I think probably online is reaches more people than in book form. I think the knowledge about frames is what might and the availability of frame knowledge, because it's such a wide field. To write a book about frames is an almost impossible task because it's like writing a book about paintings. So I think it has to go via, and ideally, I mean, people can study, go through a whole university, all stages of studying art history without ever encountering a frame. Of course, that is something that ought to be changed. I think that's probably how you preserve frames, not as materially, but preserve the right frames on paintings through the knowledge about frames.
And that's still nascent. It's
Absolutely,
still got a
progress
long way to
really
go.
of any kind.
Yeah.
I think we need curators who don't just care about the paintings, but they care about the context of the paintings, what the paintings were framed in, how they hung, and the furniture around them. And if you can show paintings in a place where there's a bit of that, just a little bit of it. I mean, the refurbishment of the NPG is brilliant in itself, but especially because in some places they've put in vitrines with pamphlets and maiolica plates, I've noticed, of the same period, and it just gives you more sense of the background of how these paintings were hung in the world they were in at the time, so to speak. And I think more galleries and museums should think about how they show their paintings and just bring in the odd bit of furniture.
Certainly their website, I don't see these days there's any excuse for not having your frames on the website if they've been selected, discussed and written about. You can't do them all, but if
You've done the Yale Centre for British Art, all their frames, and the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
The Royal Academy is interesting in one specific respect because it holds all the diploma paintings of the artist since it began in the late 18th century. So these were the original frames chosen by the artists for the paintings they wanted to give the Royal Academy as their sort of specimen, the best specimen of their art when they were accepted as RAs. So this is an incredible record of, I know Peter isn't especially keen on English frames, and some of them are really grotty, and they do go all through the 19th century. But as a collection in itself, it's valuable because they're original and they're the artist's choice. So you've got kind of Turner's really early frame on Dolbaden Castle, which is just a really plain Scotia frame. And he goes on from there and fills it with acanthus in the Bridgewater Sea Piece, which is in the National Gallery. So that sort of thing is an important record.
And of course, some of his frames have splashes of his own paint on them.
Well, loads of artist paintings do. Holman Hunt and, not Lavery, what's the man's name? The portrait painter, de Laszlo. He painted all his portraits in his frames, and lots of them have bits of paint on.
Can I end my monopoly over the discussion there and ask if anybody else has questions from the audience, please? Anyone's allowed to put their hands up? Not all at once, but... I have one question of my own, then, if I may continue to monopolise as we round this out. I think a lot of people like me are afraid of making a mistake when reframing, and that's why most of the things that I own aren't even on the wall, because I don't dare frame them because I don't want to make the mistake. What's your advice to people like me?
There are tablets you can take for that, yes.
I've tried the cream. I think I need something stronger.
Your GP will tell you about that. We'll get in touch. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. But with Photoshop like it is, you can look at a picture in all sorts of virtual frames. This is how we're doing it with clients all the time. And you soon discover what doesn't work, which is extremely important to get that out of the way as soon as you can. And then it's shades of excellence and subtleties. And these are all the things I was trying to think of at the beginning with all the role the frame has to do. It can, when you think it's pretty good, it's still got more mileage in it if you just had the frame, it was a slightly different pattern or so on. But we haven't brought in one of the key things that comes up about the frame's functions is that the structure of the picture, let's say a portrait here, the Pontormo, is basically there's two diagonals running across each corner, and the composition lines up with that. In so many paintings, and particularly portraits, the location of the head is actually being demonstrated to you geometrically with the frame's ornament, but you're not aware of it. But when you start pulling the white lines down on your screen over this picture, there's a Nella, it's in Belton House. I remember when it was in the National Gallery exhibition of National Trust portraits, and we joined together. There were corners and centers, and then centers in between the centers, and we started drawing lines between all these, and you finished up with a rhombus absolutely perfectly in just a third of the way down the picture's surface, which totally contained the head of the sitter. Now, that ain't no accident. That's designed from day one. And a lot of these things have got elements that help to deal with the construction of the picture. Certainly, Renaissance, Madonna and Child, there's all sorts of occasions there. Anyway, that's...
I know how to reframe my head.
We'll send you the prescription.
If no one has any... Oh, hi. Yes, thank you.
Hello, is this on? Hello, good afternoon. I've very much enjoyed your discussion. Thank you very much. And you've definitely convinced me how important the context of the frames are. And I like the idea of the furniture and so on as a sort of setting. However, I had one question. Does that mean that some of these old masters, in their appropriate frames, are really not suitable for some of the very modern geometric designs that we see in today's houses? You've got this gilt frame where you've got lots of grey and black and angular furniture and so on. So you would really, does that preclude people who like that sort of decor from buying something like this?
Yes, it's what happens when you want to install a 17th century Italian Baroque painting in a brand new modern house that has got no features that resemble the Baroque at all. We've just had this with a client in America who bought an extremely distinguished Rubens, which had about the best possible frame it could have for all the factors we were ticking, acquired by its previous owner, which of course so many of these things reappear on the market due to divorce and so on. But the new owner loved the picture, but he couldn't put up with this gold frame.
This appropriate frame.
It didn't work in his ultra-modern house. But it's funny. I'd keep the whole thing together, but we've done something else for him. But it shows how the setting is going to influence what the frame's like. You can't force it to be in something that's also Baroque. You've got to find a happy medium between the two, which is what we did with a Florentine 17th century frame that just had rather abstract corner and center moldings and is in black and gold. We have just made a copy of that. It looks terrific. I mean, frankly, Rubens would have been perfectly happy with that too. But the French taste has dominated for centuries in all of this. The whole of Europe looked up to France to be the leader of taste, and it's still recovering some of the museums we go to. Yeah.
It's interesting, your question there, because I'm a medieval art dealer, and a lot of the work that I handle, a lot of the objects that I handle and look at in a day are religious, and sometimes you can't get around their religiosity. And in fact, it's often odd at an art fair or an exhibition where I say, look at the way the light pools on that drop of blood, and people think you're a nutcase, you're a real psycho. And I'm there kind of poring over these images of dead Christs and Virgin and Childs and everything. But it's interesting to think from the perspective that I have to put myself in a client's shoes and think about how a piece of 14th century Dutch wood sculpture or French painted ornament or something from a church setting might work in a modern house. And some of those houses really are like Le Corbusier, as minimal as you can possibly get sometimes. And sometimes they really work well. They actually, it's the flip side of it is that sometimes it can showcase the incredible intensity or beauty of the object that you're putting into that space. Sorry to hijack that. I think we've got another question. Richard, did you want to ask one?
Just a simple one, really. I wondered, Peter, is there a resistance? I know you've done a great deal of reframing in the National Gallery, but is there ever a resistance to take off frames that are perhaps argued part of the history of that picture? I mean, you go to so many public collections, I could think of the Wallace collection or Dulwich or wherever, the frames sometimes are woefully inappropriate and do nothing for the work of art. And yet, you know, you read, well, it's part of the picture's history, we can't begin to change it. It's a bit like living in a listed building, you know. You live in a nice Regency house and somebody in the Edwardian period put up a picture rail that's just inappropriate, but the planners won't let you change it.
Yeah, those arguments are definitely, we've got this little, beautiful little Pisanello painting that was framed by Eastlake, very to the detriment of the design of the painting, but to even consider that as an object one could frame differently is to many people very unpalatable. There are other examples too. It's not too bad. We don't have that many really significant frames. That, of course, every frame that somehow ended up on a painting is part of the history of the painting. But then we do keep everything we take off, at least everything that's old, like you see on the Arnoldini marriage that ended up in a frame that was in storage for 80 years. So that is possibly the one kind of really benign thing about changing the frame is that it is the most reversible intervention you can have on a painting.
There was quite a lot of resistance to your reframing Titian's Death of Acte and...
There probably still is, yes.
Yes.
Had to fight to death.
Well, it was awful. It's in his late style, so it's lots of little bits of brushwork, and it was in this grotty sort of 19th century revival French Baroque frame, and it was that the frame was dirty and it had little squiggly patterns all over it, so the whole thing was flat and it looked like a dirty tapestry. And Peter found this amazing Venetian frame for it, and it took on a completely new life. It looked as though it had come out of a Venetian palazzo, but people objected on Twitter. They got very twittery about it. And because...
Peter, I'll retract my statements.
They're the referees these days.
But often people are just used to certain settings and find it upsetting to see it. It's like the hideous sofa that you grew up with and all the family photographs were taken in front of, then there's a certain fondness for it.
Didn't Prince Charles say at the time that, King Charles, say that the Sainsbury wing was a carbuncle on the face of an old friend? Yeah, I mean, it happens in all sorts of settings, doesn't it?
That was the one before the Sainsbury wing.
Yes.
This is why the Sainsbury wing was built, because they couldn't have the carbuncle.
Yes, and they said he wasn't much use on architecture. Brilliant. It's one of the best points he's made.
Can I ask if there are any final questions before I close this session? Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Can you just show the very last slide, please?
Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Because I think it does make a bit of a
This is,
point.
if you come back tomorrow, this is part 2. This is, where things go wrong.
Yes, this is where things things go hideously wrong, and I'd like you to take it away with you. This is Bernini on the left, framing the glory in Rome above St. Peter's chair, in a whole cloud of cherubs and angels and sunbursts and stuff, with a stained glass window in the middle of it with the Holy Spirit. And on the right-hand side is what the Uffizi has managed to do to the baptism of Christ, which has made it look like a sort of long, white, receding tunnel with this little dark image like a postage stamp at the end.
It feels completely imprisoned, doesn't it?
Yes, it looks awful. It's just shouting to escape.
Yeah.
So you see why frames are so important.
Absolutely.
Look on this picture and on this.
For anyone who's interested in looking at frames in detail, in focus, there are a number of publications which we can give you details of afterwards if you like, but there are also important displays. So the National Gallery that we've just been talking about, the National Portrait Gallery, but also the AGO in Toronto, where Lynn will be giving a keynote lecture on 2nd and 3rd of May next year on picture frames in context, a study of the AGO's collection. Also Dallas Museum and the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, just to name a few, are really good resources for looking at frames. And the Met, absolutely.
That brings to the point that the French didn't just take frames seriously. When I first started going to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, it was wall-to-wall picture frames in nests. I've got a photograph of it. Unbelievable. So beautiful and so revered. And when you haven't got a picture to take your eye off them, they are magical things to look at. So
that's a very fitting note to end on. Thank you. And thank you very much to our three speakers.